One way of understanding the law, is to go by form. Take a form, start filling up the information in the form. You will learn not only what the law says, also the jurisprudence says. Everything you will try to understand because of answering questions. That way, when you start answering questions in form number 3CD, you will come to know many more things in the context of the law, in the context of jurisprudence, rules, etc., which are very important aspects we'll pick up for our discussion. Given the time, definitely it will not be possible to exhaustively cover everything. I'll divide them into a couple of baskets. The entire classes will divide them into a couple of baskets, and each of the baskets at an important aspects will pick up for our discussion. First basket will take up dealing with certain basic details 1 to 8. 8A is subsequently introduced last year. If people are willing to opt for concessional rate of tax, of course, that is nothing too great to discuss. Therefore, will not take much time on that. Now, class 1 to 8 out of second class deals with address of the SSC. Address of the SSC. What other things one should remember here in giving the address of the SSC? First, whether to report for an individual is business address or residential address. In practical way, ideal to report business address. In theoretical understanding, whichever way you would like to take a decision, it's okay. But on a practical note, it is always ideal, advisable to give business address of the SSC in case of an individual HUF, not residential address. If the SSC has already opted to give the residential address in the income tax records, ideal to make it shifted to the business address as far as possible, as soon as possible. Now, next controversy, address as on the balance sheet date or address on signing the balance sheet, where there is a change in between. If there is no change, fine. On the balance sheet date, address is something. Even on the date of signing the balance sheet, also same address, nothing need to worry. But in between, 31st March, SSC was functioning in one place. But when you are signing the balance sheet, SSC shifted to a new place. Now, which address to give? Whether to give the previous address on the balance sheet date or the address as on the date of signing the balance sheet. Whether address on the balance sheet date or address on the date of signing the balance sheet, which is relevant. Our institute guidance note says address is only for communication. That means you would like to give address for the purpose of enabling the other person to reach you. If this is the purpose, why should we worry about an address from which you have already worked out? You will have to give only the address on the balance on the date of signing the balance sheet. It is not the address on the date of the balance sheet when there is a change. So therefore, one has to give only the address on the signing date of the balance sheet. Now, if it's a corporate entity, please verify the ROC records. In ROC records, there will be some address. And a practical note to say, you will have to compare the address available in IT PAN card or the profile page of the Income Tax Department website, software used for uploading the return of income of the SC in Chartered Accountant's office, because each of the office would file through by some private software. From previous year, that address will get carried forward. And other records other than the software, we will have some Excel, some other softwares, etc. Their address for communication of that SSC would be available. As far as possible, we must have to try and sync all these things so that one record would not speak differently from the other, and correct address will be communicated to department. As I said at the beginning, if the SSC has already given residential address in the IT department profile page, etc., as far as possible, ideal to move the address to business address. We'll come back and say why it is so at a later stage. When we are discussing class 11, we'll discuss why it is so. Class 4 talks about details of indirect tax registration. Now, tax registration details have to be given. Not all other levy, PF, ESI, all of them will not come. What needs to be seen is only tax related registration details. Other than direct tax, all other indirect tax registration. After the advent of GST, what remains outside GST as an indirect tax will be very minimum. Customs, etc., but very minimum. So indirect tax registration related details have to be given. For a customs law, there is only a code. There is no separate registration. It is only identification code. Therefore, the import export code number, IE code number, has to be given for customs related cases. Wherever the assessee has got customs related documentation, importing something, exporting something, then we will have to give the IE code. If you carefully see IE code, in the past, separate numbers were given, but in the recent past, the department started issuing the permanent account number issued by the income tax department as IE code. So both will be one and the same. But in the earlier occasions, there were different numbers coming up for IE code as well. Now, take a practical scenario where you know very well this particular assessee is liable for an indirect tax registration, but he has not obtained it. Now, let us say, for example, those days when service tax was due, he did not obtain service tax registration number, but even though he is liable. Now, what is our role? Do we need to say he is liable, but he did not obtain? But as per class 4, it says, give the details of indirect tax registration. If he has obtained registration, we have to give. If he has not obtained, let us not worry about it. What is our role? Our institute guidance note makes it very clear that if he has not obtained a particular registration on an indirect tax note, which is otherwise required to obtain, we will have to mention that fact. He is liable to get registration under indirect tax, but he has not obtained it, although he is liable. That fact has to be mentioned by us. Now, class 6 talks about previous year. What is there great to say in this? Previous year, earlier, the printed version of the form said previous year ended on 31st March dash dash dash. So what the law was expecting, forms were expecting us, previous year ended 31st March dash dash dash, 2021, 2020, 21, 22. We'll have to give only ended year date, not even date. Date is frozen, 31st March. But 4 years back, the form underwent a change. It says previous year from dash 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 to dash dash dash. What does it mean? The previous year commencement and previous year ending need not be uniform to everybody. It need not be uniform April 1st of the subsequent 31st March in all cases. Let us say, for example, it's a partnership firm commenced during the current year. So previous year from will not be the April 1st. It will be subsequent to that. But it is an ongoing concern. Therefore, 31st March will be okay. But the commencement date need not always be 1st April. So when we are conducting audit of a concern which comes into existence in the middle of the current year, then we'll have to be careful in filling up the from date. We cannot uniformly say always 1st April. Then you conduct an audit of a business which is coming to a close in the middle of this year. Let us say a partnership firm got dissolved, a company got wound up, or a proprietor business discontinued in a particular date of this year. It can be continuing from previous year, but it is ended before the end of the current year. In which case, previous year from 1st April to the date on which they discontinued the business activity. So neither April 1st permanent nor 31st March permanent. Depending on the facts of the case, relevant date should be mentioned. So newly started businesses or cessation of the businesses, you will have to pick up the relevant date and appropriately fill it up, is what the necessity came into this clause a couple of years back, which has to be properly factored and addressed. About this only we had discussed little longer yesterday. Class 8 of 44 AB, our institute repeatedly says that we have to choose the appropriate class. Class 8 says under which provision you are releasing this audit report, which class of 44 AB would apply for this assessee. About this only we had a very lengthy discussion yesterday. Now class A takes business turnover exceeding 100 lakh other than 44 AD cases, other than the proviso coming in 1 to 10 crore, that also not liable for audit. So business turnover exceeding 100 lakhs, audit under income tax law, not audit under any other law, and financial year matches. In that case, you have to choose class A. Professional gross receipt exceeding 50 lakhs, audit under income tax law, class B. Presumptive income other than 44 AD and ADA, that means 44 AE, not having income specified to that extent, then you have to say class C, audit under income tax law. That means in all these cases, you have to issue only form number 3CB. Presumptive income under 44 ADA, 11 professionals not having income of a specified percentage, namely 50% he could not offer, and gross receipt does not exceed 50 lakh rupees. Audit under income tax law, form number 3CB. Then presumptive income coming under 44 AD, not having prescribed percentage of 8 or 6, previously availed subsection 1 of 44 AD, turnover up to 200 lakhs. Then class E, audit under income tax law, form number 3CB we have to issue. We have to choose class E. Audit under some other law, LLP Act, Income Companies Act, Cooperative Societies Act, etc. Previous year matching and audit already conducted under any other law. Then we have to choose third proviso, 244 AB. Many occasions, a company having more than 1 crore turnover, people choose class A, although they issue form number 3CA. That is not appropriate. When you are issuing form number 3CA, naturally in class 8, you have to choose form third proviso to section 44 AB only. Form 3CA cases, we will have to say in class 8, third proviso only. It is not appropriate for us to choose any of these clauses and still issuing form 3CA. Moment we have decided to issue form number 3CA, we will have to choose third proviso to section 44 AB. 3CB we are issuing, then any of these 5 classes we can choose. When we are doing audit for a normal case, A for a business, B for a profession. Presumptive cases, these 3, but you are not coming under presumptive number, and therefore you are getting audit, then 3C, D, E, depending on the relevant section. The next is class 11, dealing with books of account. Books of account, there are 3 subclasses we will have to remember here. One is books of account prescribed. Second one is books of account maintained. Then books of accounts verified, audited by us, examined with the right language. Now, what is the role of books of account prescribed? For which we need to understand what the law says in section 44AA subsection 1. 44AA subsection 1 says, for prescribed professionals and notified professionals, 11 professionals, the prescribed books have to be maintained. Rule 6F prescribes the books to be maintained for these 11 specified professionals. 7 of them comes in the statute, 4 of them subsequently notified. Totally 11 professionals, you will have to go with the rule 6F. What does it say? Rule 6F says cash book, ledger, journal. For medical practitioner, 2 other documents separately added: daily case register, inventory register. So for 11 professionals only, rule 6F says these 3 books and other documents, 2, daily case register, inventory register. Now, if you are doing audit of any of these 11 professionals and exceeding 50 lakh gross receipts, 44 AB class B will apply, in which case in 3CD class 11, you have to say books prescribed, cash book, ledger, journal for these 11 professionals. If you are auditing a case of these 11 professionals, gross receipt is less than 50 lakh and he claims, the assessee claims, the net income from that profession is not 50% of the gross receipt, it is something less than that. In which case also 44 AB class D would apply. You will issue form number 3CB. In this class 3CD, class 11, you will have to say books prescribed, cash book, ledger, journal. If other than these 11 professionals, for anybody else you carry out audit, 44AA subsection 1 does not apply to them. That means for all other professionals, other than these 11 professionals, all other professionals and all the businesses in the country, all other professionals and all the businesses of the country, no books are prescribed. When we carry out audit for a business case or a presumptive income not able to offer the prescribed percentage under 44 AD or 44 AE, then we will have to say books not prescribed. For them, saying books prescribed is not appropriate. When we are carrying out audit for a profession where gross receipt exceeds 50 lakh, for a profession covered by these 11 categories, gross receipt exceeds 50 lakh, we should say books prescribed. Yes. What are the books prescribed? Cash book, ledger. And class 44 AB, class D, less than 50 lakhs, not able to offer 50%. Then only we should say for these 11 professional cases, books are prescribed. Yes. For all other cases, we should not say books prescribed. Yes. Books not prescribed. For all other professionals and all businesses in the country, you will have to say books not prescribed. Then what is that you have to maintain? 44 AA subsection 2 says to maintain such books to enable the assessing officer to compute the income under the act. So whatever you feel comfortable, you maintain, but establish that based on these books, your income is correct. But to establish the correctness of the income computed, you can decide such books which will help you. So the list is going to be lengthy. Each businesses would require different type of books to be maintained to substantiate your case, but law does not prescribe anything for the cases covered. Now, for 11 professionals, when are you required to maintain the books? When gross receipts in any of the preceding 3 years do not exceed 1.2 lakhs, you are not required to maintain books. In any of the years it exceeded 1.2 lakh, then you will have to maintain it. If this is the current year in which you have set up the profession, current year the receipt likely to cross 1.2 lakh, maintain it. If not, there is no need to maintain it. This is for these 11 professionals. All other professionals, other than the specified 11 professionals and all other businesses, subsection 2 of 44 AA says, income in any of the preceding 3 years exceeds 1.2 lakh for others, and for individual HU of 2.5 lakh rupees, or sales turnover gross receipts in any of the 3 preceding years exceeds 10 lakh for others and for individual HU of 25 lakhs, then books are required to be maintained. For newly started business or profession, this limit would apply if for the current year the limit is likely to cross, in which case this limit would apply. Please remember, this is the requirement to maintain books. Either the prescribed books for this or such books which will enable the AO to compute the income in the Income Tax Act once this threshold crossed. Who will be entitled to get away from maintaining those books? An assessee who is coming under 44 AE and offers the minimum threshold prescribed therein or additional amount over and above that. For that assessee, this is not required. And an assessee coming under 44 ADA, gross receipt less than 50, 11 professionals, not required to maintain the books. Even though this threshold is crossed, still is not required because that section provides for exception. An assessee previously availed 44 AD subsection 1, current year, he continues to avail. In the case you avail, even though the threshold is crossed, you are not required to maintain the books. So this is the requirement to maintain books for 11 professionals and all others. But nevertheless, if the assessee is willing to come under the presumptive provision, he is not required to maintain. Now that is books prescribed. Now next bullet, we will have to say books maintained by assessee. Now even for the 11 cases, we will have to say what actually assessee maintains. All other case also we have to say what assessee actually maintains. We'll have to say what assessee actually maintains. The clause further goes to say what are the books assessee maintained, in which is the place in which he maintains. If he is maintaining in more than one place, you have to say all such place. So if the books are maintained in more than one place, you will have to say in which place it is maintained. So giving only one place is not appropriate. If books are maintained in branch as well as in head office, branch also we have to say. head office also we have to say. And not only giving address sufficient, in which place, which books maintained. So each books, where all they maintained, we have to give that detail. And if the computerized system gives the Booksafe account, we'll have to say whether books are maintained manually or in a computerized system, and where the server and node concept, a dependent node and independent server maintained, location of the server has to be mentioned. Why we are highlighting this again and again? The need to appreciate the nuances of law in terms of section 133A. Some of you may be able to recall that 133A provides power to the officer to conduct a survey on a business premises and impound the books found. So a survey authority can enter into the business premises and impound the books, and a search authority in contrast can enter into even a residential premises if he has been authorized by the authorizing officer to carry out a search. The authorizing officer has to have a reason to believe that this person had not disclosed income or would not be disclosing income unless the search is taken place, in which case the authorizing officer can authorize an authorized officer to carry out a search. Once that search warrant comes under section 132, the action can be taken even in a residential premises. But in the case of survey, the power is limited. The survey authorities can enter into the premises only for a business premises. But if your written says the place in which you are carrying on business, the residential address is given as the address of the business, then the assessee voluntarily says, this is my business premises. So he is inviting to his residence a survey authority. And once the survey authorities came to the residential address and then found this is not the place they are carrying on business, they will go elsewhere, but they will not get out. They can retain this premises also for carrying out activities. Sometimes information other than business will also be remaining in that place, which will invite some other consequences to assessee. Keeping this in mind, always it is essential to give the business address so that even if a survey takes place, the survey would not take place in a residential premises. The assessee gives residential address for business, even though a physical business is carried on elsewhere, then he will invite survey authorities to his residence, which is not warranted in law unless the assessee is so interested to do so. So therefore, books maintained, one has to be careful in giving all this information. And this is where assessee maintains all these things. What are the matters which we have examined? Whether assessee has exposed everything to us so that we have examined everything, or assessee has given part of it and part of which he has not given. So what is maintained can be examined. What is not maintained cannot be examined. We have seen some cases where books maintained, that particular information is not there. But in books examined, that information is there. How can that be? So you'll have to be careful in comparing the classes to say what is maintained out of which we are examining something. What is shown as examined, not found under the class maintained, that means something is not appropriately presented. So examined out of the books maintained, what are all something which we have examined, we will have to mention. Before 4 years, we are required to say what books we have examined. But in the last 4 years, we have to say not only books examined, also other relevant documents examined. So we will have to say not only books examined by us, also other relevant documents. What do you mean by other relevant documents? Documents which will substantiate the entries made in the books. The underlying documents which would substantiate the entries made in the books. The list can be cannot be exhaustive, it can be illustrative. One can always apply the professional judgment in drawing the line here. I can say for satisfying myself on a purchase transaction, I'll ask for the basic purchase document, namely purchase invoice. Some other may say, in addition to this, I'll also see e-way bill. Some other may say, even in addition to that, I'll see GST returns. So for one transaction found in the books, more than one way, assessee, the auditor can examine the documents to satisfy himself. So primary documents, purchase bills, sales invoices, etc., we'll have to say. Then certain secondary documents we can add on subject to our comfort, like TDS returns, service GST returns, and few other returns, all that you can add on, but the list is going to be endless. One has to apply the professional judgment as far as other relevant documents are concerned. Sometimes bank confirmation letters, BRS, etc. One can continue to say to satisfy oneself whether the entries made are appropriate or not, but one has to draw the professional judgment in drawing up a particular Lakshman Rekha here, particular line. Otherwise, list is going to be endless. Now, these are all certain basic aspects. Having examined the basic aspects, we'll come to the classes dealing with your audited accounts. Instead of going from class 9, 10, 11, 12, 41, 42, 43, we will divide them into baskets. First, I'll take up asset side of the balance sheet. What are the classes which have relevances for the asset side of the balance sheet? We'll examine. Then we'll go to liability side. Then we'll go to the income side. Then we'll go to expenses side. Then we'll go to certain other aspects other than these four, if time permits. First, we'll take up the asset side of the balance sheet. First item will be fixed assets. What is the class which has the relevance for this fixed assets? Class 18 of the form number 3CD. So when you are carrying out audit and filling up the clause of class 18, first what we need to see, addition of the current year. The opening written down value of the block in the balance sheet and in the income tax returns need not be one and the same and should not be sometimes one and the same because of varying percentages, etc. But first aspect is, by and large, these sort of clerical errors are not happening if you follow practically a private software like CompuSoft, Winman, so on and so forth. But when some people continue to follow the website of the institute, website of the income tax department, download, do it, the previous year information is populated automatically. In which case, it is ideal, advisable to see what was the number given in the last year return, last year tax audit report in class 18 as closing WDV, whether the same number is populated, the same number is brought forward for each of the block in the current year. Something one has to examine. We have seen cases where last year concluded closing WDV in the audit report attached accounts or a financial or form number 3CD clause 18, current year opening block are not found to be one and the same. Assessee sometimes may miss out something, but as an auditor, we cannot allow that type of errors to come and continue to get uploaded without having any qualification. As I said at the beginning, the assessee said, last year I made a mistake, sir. This time I'm correcting the opening WDV. I won't like this to go in this version only. If he's adamant on it, para 3 of 3CA, para 5 of 3CB, we will have to draw the attention of the taxman that last year concluded WDV and current year opening WDV not one and the same for these reasons. That point has to come from our side as an auditor. The assessee sticks onto that, but by and large, there could be an arithmetic error, which if at all we compare properly, it could get addressed appropriately. But without that verification, it should not go. But in 90% of the cases, when people follow private software, after you lock that uploaded documents in the software, next year when you take it, automatically the opening WD comes and the chances of error getting addressed by the system itself, ideal to once check it, because there are a couple of cases where we have seen the errors were there, which should not happen. Number one. Then we come to addition. Addition, what does section say? 43 class 1. Section 43 class 1. Actual cost definition. Actual cost means actual cost of the asset to the assessee as reduced by any portion thereof met by any person or authority. Actual cost definition has got 2 proviso and 15 explanation. The second proviso was introduced from 17 April 1st. What does it say? Similar to section 48.3. If you incur actual cost for which you made payment exceeding 10,000 rupees in a day in aggregate to a person, otherwise then by account pay crossed check or draft or bank account or ECS system, that expenditure shall be ignored for the purpose of determining actual cost. Friends, as I said, 2 provisos are there and we have 15 explanations are there. We are not having time to discuss all of them. Very quickly, the latest 2017 proviso will pick up. So Similar to what we see in 48.3, here also, when you are incurring an expenditure for acquiring an asset, which you would like to take it as part of the block, but for which payment is made in aggregate in a day to a person exceeding 10,000, otherwise than by account pay across draft or check or through ECS, it shall not form part of the block. You have to exclude it. You should not make it as part of the cost of the asset. This is coming into effect from 1st of April 2017. Now, in 48.3, in contrast, to compare, there is an exception. What does it say? That exception says for a freight payment, instead of 10,000, that ceiling should be counted as 35,000. Such exception is not borrowed for the proviso below section 43 clause 1. So what irony it creates now? When you make a freight payment for your revenue account for getting your inventory up to 35,000 rupees, you are permitted to make cash payment. But the very same vehicle, you are using it to bring machinery to you from some other place to your place, and the freight payment goes beyond 10,000 up to 35,000. That will not be eligible to be counted as part of the cost. This is a real irony. How will you explain to your driver of the vehicle that if you bring me my inventory, I'll give you up to 35,000 in cash. But if you bring me machinery, which is not an inventory to me, you will be given cash only up to 10,000. Over and above, I'll give you only account pay cross check. Which driver of the vehicle will accept when he has taken the vehicle all the way from a faraway place? For going back, he will require money to pay fuel. So he will ask for cash. Distinguishing that revenue transaction and capital transaction, he will say, everybody, when I deliver the goods, give me only cash up to 35,000 rupees as against 10,000 rupees ceiling, normal ceiling. And explaining him that I have taken only machinery from you, not an ordinary inventory, therefore I will not be able to do, is a very tricky scenario in real world. Unfortunately, the government is not seized of the matter and they have not addressed this aspect in spite of being brought to their knowledge many occasions. But as an auditor, you will have to be careful. The freight on capex up to 10,000, you can add it to the block of asset. Over and above, you are not entitled to add it to the block of asset. As a person who knows the law, we should not allow this error to come. We will have to be careful about it. Now, a couple of aspects when you are examining this. Now, practically, you may come across a scenario where you get a credit purchase of the machinery. And this year you do not pay. Next year you pay. This year, well, next year, it still requires to be paid, not yet paid, but you close the accounts. Can you wait and see what happens? Answer is no. This year they have paid, they have incurred the expenditure. This year itself they paid in violation of the second proviso. Don't add it to the block of asset. This year they've incurred expenditure on credit. Up to 31st March, they have not paid. Then next year, what will happen? This year they have not paid, it will go to the block. Next year, if they pay in violation of the limit, nothing need be done. Unfortunate that this is not addressed appropriately in the law. So better view seems to be, or an litigating view seems to be, this year you incur expenditure, this year you violate the law in making payment, this year it will not form part of the block of asset. If you make an expenditure this year, add it to the block during this year, and next year you violate, there is no provision to disturb the opening WDV, forget about it. Matter ends there. Then 10,000 rupees is the part. If you get an asset for 10,000 and add on the top of it 18%, so 11,800, what you consider as an asset value is 10,000 because 1,800 you take ITC. In which scenario, what is added to the asset is only 10,000, which does not exceed 10,000, it will qualify. That ITC part, you take it to separate account. So you don't need to count the ITC cash payment for disqualifying the block. Asset to be getting entered into the block. Basic value consider ITC, so long as it is eligible for credit, remove it. If you purchase an item which is not even qualifying for ITC benefit, then it will be forming part of the cost. And including ITC, if the total amount paid exceeds 10,000, then the entire amount will not form part of block. But if the ITC is eligible, exclude ITC, balance doesn't cross 10,000, ignoring ITC, if the number is going to be well within 10,000, you can add it to the cost of the asset. Now, all of you know section 32, subsection 1, clause 2 provides for depreciation. What does it say? on the written down value at the prescribed percentage, you are entitled to get depreciation in respect of block of assets. So block of assets, WDV, prescribed percentage will be allowed. Agreed. Now, how do you arrive at the written down value? Written down value means opening written down value as increased by the asset added to the block concerned minus money is payable in respect of assets sold, demolished, discarded, destroyed together with scrap value if any. So this is what is the WDV calculation on which you will apply the percentage prescribed. Now you acquire an asset and put that asset into use for a period of 180 days or less. Instead of giving normal percentage, you are entitled to take only half of the normal rate. That is what the second proviso below section 32 subsection 1 clause 2 talk about. So effectively, what does it say? If you are acquiring an asset in a financial year in the previous year and put that asset into use in that previous year for less than 180 days, you are entitled to take only half of the normal rate of depreciation. We are comfortable on this. There is no quarrel about it. Now, take a scenario where February month, the SSE purchases a machinery, brings it into its factory. But for some technical reason, this could not be employed, used for his business. It is kept in WIP. Now, next year, somewhere in the month of October only, the problem could be solved properly. Next year, October 15th onwards, the SSE is able to make use of this machinery for production purposes. First year, it is kept in WIP. Second year, we started using it. But what's the date of put to use? October 15th. So how much depreciation in the second year we can claim? Half of the normal rate. 15% is the effective rate. 7.5% we will be able to claim. Agree. But now go back to the proviso. Where will the proviso restrict? In which of the circumstances the proviso restricts? An asset acquired in 1 year, in the financial year, in the previous year, and put to use in the same financial year for less than 180 days. Then half of the normal rate would apply. If I acquire an asset in one financial year, but I put to use in another financial year, proviso does not apply. Since proviso does not apply in our case, that restriction of half of the normal rate will not apply to that particular asset. That means full rate of depreciation would be available. So if I acquire an asset in the month of February in 1 year, put to use that asset in the subsequent year, on or after October 15th, I should be eligible to claim full rate of depreciation. But in the real world, when we are dealing with these sort of claims in electronic form, when machines are only directing us to make appropriate claim, how will we say this is an asset in which we acquired last year, put to use in the current year, more, but that restriction of 180 days would not apply. I am entitled for 15%. How are you going to make use of this particular law in this present day context when machines are driving us to claim? The forms are driven through electronic way of presenting our case. How are we going to make use of it? It is possible. It is not that it is not possible, it is possible. When you are filling up the information in year 1, assets added to the block, for the asset which is not eligible for depreciation for the reason that it is not put to use, you should give the details of that addition also. So now what will happen? This one asset we purchased in February, in the year of purchase, make this as addition. Date of acquisition 15th February 2020. Date of put to use dash. Then what the system will do in the first year? It will take this as block without depreciation. It adds to the block and no depreciation. Next year, you bring forward opening WDV from the previous year. This number also comes up. Out of the block, one portion of the asset in the block not yet depreciated, rest all depreciated. The data is preserved. So next year, out of the opening value of the block, asset not depreciated number comes up in the system. For that, what is the date of actual use? You put that number current year, 15th February, 15th December, 15th October, whatever is the date. Moment you say this year I have put to use, irrespective of the date on which it is put to use. It will qualify for full year depreciation. System requires to know whether you have put to use in the current year. If it is put to use, you are entitled for full rate of depreciation. So to preserve this benefit, what one has to do in the first year in which the acquisition takes place, even if it is not put to use, we have to give the information in addition column. Many occasions, the WIPs are not factored in the addition column. People will take up WIPs only in the year in which it is actually put to use. In the year of being WIP, they will ignore to give the data in the addition column. That only disables them to claim the normal depreciation in a year subsequent to the year of acquisition, even if it is put to use for less than 180 days. So therefore, this aspect we will have to keep it in our mind. The next one is CENVAT. Explanation 9 also clearly says when you claim CENVAT or GST, remove that component. Balance only you should add to the cost of the asset. Okay, you are adding it to the cost of asset. Year 1, I have purchased 10 lakh rupees asset. 1,80,000 is this GST, ITC. I have taken to ITC account. I have added 10 lakh rupees. I have claimed depreciation. 1.5 years later, the GST authorities come for inspection and then say, this particular asset is not eligible for ITC. This particular asset is not eligible for ITC. Therefore, they are saying reverse it. I am claiming, I am agreeing for that proposition. I am not willing to dispute. Therefore, I am reversing it from ITC. Now, where will I debit? From ITC credit, I am reversing it. If I debit to P&L account, it is as good as charging it to revenue as a revenue deduction. That is impermissible because this ITC is an asset. It cannot be claimed as a revenue expenditure. So if I add it to the block, in the year in which I am adding to the block, I have not purchased any new asset. So in the financials as well as in the income tax return, what happens now? I am incurring an expenditure for an asset in year 1. Primary value I have added to the cost of the asset. ITC portion I have removed, taken to ITC account separate. In a subsequent year, if the inspection has taken place in the very first year, they have declared it to be disqualifying asset for ITC purpose. I would have reversed it from ITC account and added to the cost of the asset and eligible to claim depreciation. Now the event of disregarding this as an eligible asset for the purpose of ITC took place in a subsequent year. So therefore, in that year, I am removing it from ITC account. In that case, I have to add it to the cost of the asset. So now, when I'm adding to the cost of the asset, physically there was no addition to that asset in that year. Nevertheless, I am entitled to add to the cost of the asset in a subsequent year and claim depreciation prospectively. As because I am reversing it in year 2, I should not ask for depreciation from year 1. That is not permissible. So from the year in which it is reversed prospectively, I am entitled to claim depreciation. I have purchased an asset for the purpose of carrying on my business, but before it is getting ready in the assembly stage itself, I am selling it. For the reason that my business did not really suit for it, or that asset is not functioning properly, or the output may not really be up to the mark. For some reason at the WIP stage itself, I am selling it. Whether it will form part of turnover for the purpose of this 100 lakhs, 10 crore, etc. Answer is no, because purchasing and selling that asset is not my business. The amount should be sales, gross receipts, turnover in business of the SSC. Now, purchasing and selling the asset in WIP stage is not the business of the SSC. Therefore, it will not form part of turnover, although for the purpose of GST, it may be counted so. Now, coming to the reduction part. What does section 43 class 6 say? Money is payable in respect of assets sold, demolished, discarded, destroyed together with scrap value, if any. So opening WDV, some addition to the block total minus money is payable in respect of assets sold, demolished, discarded, destroyed together with scrap value. Remove that. Balance is positive, claim depreciation. Balance is negative. What will happen? Section 50 would operate. When section 50 operates, it will be considered as gain. It will be gain, short-term capital gain. Now, there was a machinery. This machinery was with us for several years. This machinery is now sold. For some reason, the fancy price comes for this machinery. Now, opening WD of the block, let us say 5 lakh rupees. Addition during the year 0. So, total 5 lakh. There are 5 machineries for this 5 lakh rupees. One machinery I am able to sell for 7 lakh. Now, 5 lakh opening WDV. Addition 0. Reduction, money is payable in respect of assets sold, 7 lakh. So block becomes negative, 2 lakh rupees. Block becomes negative, 2 lakh rupees. But we have 3 more assets. Out of 5 assets, 1 is sold, 4 more assets are there. Even if 4 assets are there, block becomes negative, it will become income under section 50, short-term capital gain. Now, remember, section 50 creates a fiction to call this income statutorily as short-term capital gain. Fine. Now let us say, for example, you have brought forward long-term capital loss. You have brought forward long-term capital loss. Can you set off long-term brought forward capital loss against this short-term capital gain? Answer is no. At the very first sight, one will come to close. What does section 74 say? Well, restricting this inter-head source set off between long-term and short-term. What does it say? A loss arising from transfer of a long-term capital asset shall not be eligible to be set off except a gain arising from transfer of a long-term capital asset. Now, asset is long-term, gain long-term. Asset is short-term, gain also short-term. When you have long-term capital gain, short-term capital gain, tax. Long-term capital loss, short-term capital loss, carry forward. Long-term capital gain, short-term capital loss, no problem. Long-term capital loss, short-term capital gain, a doubt would come. Can you set off? Law does not compare the resultant number. Law restricts on the quality of asset. Law does not restrict on the resultant number. At the cost of repetition, I am saying so. Law does not compare the resultant number. Law compares only the quality of the asset. Section 74 says, loss arising from transfer of a long-term capital asset shall not be allowed to be set off except against income arising from transfer of a long-term capital asset. In the given example, we have started with 5 lakh rupees opening WDV, 7 lakh one asset sold, 2 lakh minus short-term capital gain. That one asset we have sold, machinery. If that machinery was held by us for more than 3 years, the asset which we have sold was long-term, but the resultant gain is short-term. Now you get this point clear. Asset which we have sold long-term, but the gain which has come is short-term. Now you have brought forward a long-term capital loss. What is the restriction in section 74? The long-term capital loss, the loss arising from transfer of a long-term capital asset can be set off only from a gain arising from transfer of a long-term capital asset. The machinery which we have sold now is a long-term capital asset generating short-term capital gain because of section 50. Section 50 deems the ultimate gain as short-term. Nowhere section 50 says the asset itself short-term. So therefore, long-term brought forward capital loss can be set off against the 2 lakh rupees income deemed as short-term capital gain by section 50. Although the character of the asset is long-term, therefore section 74 does not bar this set off. So what we have to remember, long-term it is not appropriate to say long-term capital loss can be set off only against long-term capital gain. Short-term capital gain is not eligible for set off. If you take that principle in your mind, you are going to commit a mistake. Gain arising from transfer of a long-term capital asset is eligible for setting off of loss arising from transfer of a long-term capital asset. Keep that principle in mind. This benefit is possible. In the given example, if we say it is not machinery, if it is a factory building block, factory building sold, block becomes negative. You have money, you have surplus. The resultant gain is short term, but the asset which you hold, that long term building was long term, you have brought forward capital loss on long term, you can set off. Alternatively, asset which you have sold is long term in nature. The association individually can work out 54F also. The association individual or a company, you can work about section 54 easy also. Land or building transfer being in long term nature, up to 50 lakh rupees you are entitled to get re-rolling benefit in terms of section 54 easy, quite possible. So don't think that section 50 has to necessarily suffer tax. Re-rolling benefit possible, set off losses can be claimed. These are all certain important principles relating to depreciation and related connected aspects one has to keep in mind. Now, section in next item in the balance sheet would be inventory, SENVAT and related items, class 14, class 27, class 35. Please remember 145A or institute guidance note says revenue neutral, but still if somebody follows net method in presenting the tax just duty by whatever name called on purchases, sales, inventory, you will have to gross it up and prepare that grossing up number. Although it is ultimately zero, you will have to gross it up. How much to be added to opening stock, how much to be added to purchases, how much to be added to sales, how much to be added to closing stock. Again, the neutral number will come. That you have to mention in the clause concerned, even if the impact is zero. ICDS, there are 10 ICDS available, out of which for 8 ICDS we have to give disclosure. 10 ICDS, wherever variations are there, we will have to report. As because no variation, disclosure cannot be compromised. For 8 ICDS, you will have to necessarily give disclosure that cannot be compromised. Coming to SENVAT, class 27, up to 30th of June 2017, up to GST not coming in, up to that point, we'll have to give ITC on SENVAT. After that, the original form which came in the notification in the parliamentary gazette doesn't contain ITC on GST. But CBDT's offline utility also contains ITC on GST. So the assessee is very strong in saying original form only talks about SENVAT, not on GST. Today SENVAT is not there. I'm not going to give that information. Nothing wrong in it. If the assessee wishes to say so, let him give it. Merely because assessee does not say, we are not required to qualify. Quantitative particulars in class number 35. What we need to consider? There are a couple of aspects. If the assessee is a trading case, then we have to give trading information properly. If the assessee is doing manufacturing, raw material, finished goods comparison, there will be a yield percentage. By and large, many occasions, the assessee doesn't provide yield or it is difficult for him to maintain the data. Assessee doesn't provide yield, but that column is not filled up. If that is not filled up, it is duty on the part of the auditor to say in para 3 of 3CA or para 5 of 3CB that yield percentage not given. So when yield percentage is also not given and no mention is mentioned in the, nothing is mentioned in para 3 or 5 of 3CA, 3CB, that is not correct. So when yield percentage not given, we will have to mention about it in our audit report to the para 3, para 5 of 3CA, 3CB as the case may be. Quantitative details partly given, we are unable to verify in full, then a disclaimer is necessary accordingly. And trading division, manufacturing division, trading stock, closing stock zero, therefore purchase sales also not reported, manufacturing only reported. But in the nature of business, the assessee says I'm also doing trading and manufacturing. Then we will have to bifurcate. When the nature of business says he is doing trading and manufacturing, trading we should carve out, trading data we should give separately, manufacturing we should carve out, manufacturing we should give the data separately. Not giving details about trading is not appropriate. So now I feel asset side we have covered. Before going to the liability side, whatever queries we have got, we'll take up for our discussion for a couple of minutes, and then we will go further for liability side of the balance sheet. In the chat box, one question came, I think for one person, other person has answered that, so therefore fine. Form number 3CD class 29 partnership firm capital has been converted into private limited company. Authorized share capital 50,000, share premium 50,000, totally 1 lakh. No receipt by private limited company, whether section 56(2)(b attracts. We'll come back to that 56(2)(b at the end of the session after we finish the liability side of the balance sheet and other forms. Is a very interesting question. Is there any logic behind section 50 for dealing profit? It should be deeming the profit on sale of fixed asset as short term. The idea is to see once prior to 1992, for each asset we will have to calculate the depreciation. Each asset we have to preserve the data. We will have to offer the profit on sale of asset for taxation. Government thought it may not be appropriate to chase all these things, and therefore they clubbed it to block. Then for a mechanism purpose, they said, one time we are giving you depreciation. That means you're enjoying it. Then when you get a profit, very rarely you'll get profit unless you wind down your activity. When you are in an ongoing concern, you'll keep adding assets. So you'll not get profit at all. In case where you find a black block ceases to be in existence, then we will call it as, you should not be entitled to argue that I've kept the asset for more than 3 years. I'll take indexation benefit. I'll claim concessional rate of 20% tax. One side we are giving you depreciation. Therefore, in an ongoing concern, section 50 will operate very less. So therefore, they want to call it as short term, whereby you are not entitled for the concessional rate of 20% and you are not entitled for indexation benefit. That's the reason why section 50 came out with this particular proposition. Two businesses, petrol pump and wine. What do you want? I would request the queries to slightly elaborate this particular query. Therefore, we will discuss this after we finish the remaining. Labor Welfare Fund employee contribution should be shown in class 20. When we are coming to class 20, we will discuss this. Whether two audit reports are clubbed into one. I think the query is not very clear. Two audit reports. Whether two audit reports club into one. If there is only one auditor doing audit for all the organization, he should issue only one audit report. If there is more than one auditor to look into all the accounts, then joint audit report. If more than one auditor looking into audit of the respective divisions, branches, or line of activity to the respective domain which they have seen, they have to issue separate audit reports. Clubbing of these audit reports will not come unless the branch auditor doesn't file the audit report directly to the department, but he forwards to the statutory central auditor. Under 43 clause 1, you have told any payment exceeding 10,000 other than mode prescribed will not be considered as cost of asset. Then can it be allowed as an expenditure exceeding 10,000 rupees, or should it be taxable? It is, the question is, if you make about 10,000 rupees payment otherwise than the prescribed mode, it will not form part of the block of asset. It will not get added to the cost of asset. I purchase, let us say, for example, I am purchasing a mobile phone. I go and pay cash 15,000 rupees. It will not be added to the plant and machinery. That will not give me a right to say, I'll treat this as an expenditure. The nature of the asset is considered as an asset, but it will not get added to the block. Therefore, my depreciation is not eligible for it. My claim towards depreciation is not possible. It will consider only, it will be kept as a fixed asset without depreciation. For want of time, I will not explain further. Now, this is an asset which doesn't enter into block. Now, what will happen then? It is an asset on which I have not claimed depreciation. 2 years later, I sell it for, say, for example, 7,000 rupees. What will happen? Original cost 15. I have not claimed depreciation. It remains in the book as it is. I sold it for 7. So 15 minus 7, I'll get a short-term capital gain. If I sell it after 3 years, then it will be a long-term capital gain. 15,000 I can index and compare with 7,500, I can book short-term capital, long-term capital loss also. But it is not taxable initially. Your eligible depreciation will come down. To that extent, you will pay more tax. But the asset does not lose its character as an asset. It will continue to be an asset. In the year of its disposal, you can book loss depending on the age. But it will not be, it is a negative way of restricting your depreciation, but it is not regarded as an income taxable. What is the next question? Is there any, yeah, we have finished that. Can we revise tax audit reports? Fine. Very interesting proposition. Revision of tax audit report permissible legally and sometimes practically also. Though the question is not with reference to this, it should be yesterday's discussion. Since it's followed of yesterday's discussion, I'm taking it up. See, one legal possibility we'll discuss when we are coming to class 26. Practically, let us say, for example, instead of 17, we have typed in 17B instead 17C, or 21B instead 21C, we have done it. Now, our CPC compares your return of income with the tax audit report. Tax audit report says in 21C you have incurred this much, but your return of income says 21B this much. Whatever ought to have come in 21B, you have voluntarily disallowed in return of income. So CPC will compare both and say to the assessee, it will send a notice. It will not say that you have given voluntarily something as a disallowable. What it would say, your auditor has said in 21C it is something disallowable, but in your return of income that is not there, we are proposing to add. CPC will not say whatever ought to have come in the audit report in 21B, you have voluntarily disallowed. That they will not say. 21C, your auditor said something to be disallowed. That you did not disallow in the computation. So we are going to add. A notice will come giving you 30 days time. Now what option you have got? If you stick on to your audit report, assay has to take up this matter all the way to appeal. System will not read all these things. So what's the practical way out? Simple. For this technical jumbling of figures from one column to next column, etc., nobody is going to find fault. Therefore, with a note, you can file form number 3C, B3CD or 3C, 3CD revised with a disclaimer, with a note that this column, there is jumbling of figure, therefore we are revising it. Take separate UDIN and file. Once you file it, the return will get reprocessed. So 21B, auditor also says disallowed. Assessee also says 21B were disallowed. The same number in the idea, it will get matched. So no disallowance. So for that reason, practically, when jumbling of numbers take place, you are entitled to file a revised report. It will not be viewed seriously, quite possible. And whether we can file ITR without filing tax audit report. Theoretically, yes, no doubt about it. But if your turnover in the business cross the limit prescribed, then instead the CPC will send 139(9) defect notice saying that your case is liable for audit. You have filed ITR without audit. So we are going to declare your entire ITR as defective unless you file the audit report within 15 days from the date of receipt of this notice or such extended time as may be allowed. So unless you file the audit report for that case, it will become a defective return, and therefore consequently it's as if return not filed at all. It will take a shape as if return not filed at all. Then there is no point when the return is declared to be defective and not at all filed. So you can file, but later on you will be compelled to file a tax audit report, failing which it will be viewed as if you have never filed the return at all. Is there any time limit for revision of tax audit report? Reasonably before processing takes place, you can do it. There are occasions in practical life we have done it even after processing, but before completion of regular assessment, wherever there are technical errors. See the example which I have given. While in the CPC, instead of filing a revised tax audit report, they kept on writing letter to CPC. CPC, there is no manpower. Only 30 people are there to process all the returns of the whole country. Therefore, nobody sees the letter. So only machine compares. So machine rejects the letter and adds. Now, before the regular assessment takes place, you file a revised tax audit report. And in the regular assessment, they compare and they allow your claim. So if not done before the CPC, at least before regular assessment is completed, you can do it. Sometimes before the CIT appeal also practically one can try. So therefore, as long as there is error of this nature, jumbling of figures from one column to another column, etc., there is no need to have a very strong view of not to revise. It is always possible to do so. Tax audit was not done within the due date. What are the consequences? We'll discuss this in the last slide. What are the consequences? We'll take up for our discussion later. Consequences on CA for revision of tax audit report. Again, if the errors found subsequently revised by the CA in the tax audit report is of a clerical nature, jumbling of figures, etc., where otherwise the number is perfect, All other audit requirements are carried out only when keying in the number from one column to other column it was done. There will not be any consequences to the chartered accountant. It can be considered as a reasonable cost. It can always be considered leniently. But if the number undergoes change, everything undergoes change or a substantial change takes place on the very number itself, then it may result in other consequences, both in the income tax law, section 271J will come, as well as disciplinary proceedings in the institute proceedings. Depending on what error committed in the tax audit report, we will have to take a call suitably. I think only this much questions, excepting those questions we have carried forward for the next session. After the session is over, we will take up that. I think rest all we have covered. We'll come back for question answers after we finish this, right? Fine. Suresh, it's okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. A few more
Sure.
questions come. Let us see. Can a CA certify the tax audit report of a relative? More in not in a tax audit perspective, but on an institute pronouncement. Please refer to the institute pronouncement. Actually, it prohibits when your independence is doubted. You cannot. When you want to give an independent report, and when he is a relative, how can you give an independent report? And personally, friends, make yourself very clear on one important aspect. These reasons you don't need to have in a pronouncement, and you should do it by yourself. Why should somebody say you are not independent when you are certifying for a relative? When he is a relative, always there will be a bias from outside. You may be independent, but people will see you are a relative. How can you be independent? So we should be above suspicion. So we must not undertake that particular assignment at all. There need not be a separate guideline or a ethics pronouncements for this. Not only we should be independent, for others it should appear that we are independent. So even when there is no pronouncement, we should not do this. Is how we should gear up ourselves. See, there are a number of accounting auditing standards have come up in the recent past. Imagine in the 80s and 90s, whether these many accounting auditing standards were there? No. Does that mean earlier periods or say forefathers have not done the audit appropriately? They had their own personal regulations. If this is the transaction, I will allow you to write only like this. You cannot inflate your income to just defraud somebody. You cannot postpone your expenses if there is real loss. So they had their own personal conviction. We did not have accounting standard for leases. We did not have accounting standard for related party disclosure. But our forefathers did this because of their personal conviction. So this is how we will have to gear up. A pronouncement may sometimes guide, but when these are convictions which we need to evolve, necessarily there is no need for a pronouncement. Even otherwise, we should come forward and say, is my relative? Always the outside world will have a bias about my conduct, which I don't want to entertain. Let somebody else do it. That's how we will have to review this particular proposition. One question has come again on the cash expense. See, I am incurring an expenditure for acquiring an asset in respect of which I make payment in cash exceeding 10,000. It will not enter into the block. On that particular amount, I am not entitled to claim depreciation. That will not give me a right to write off this asset in the P&L account. That's not permissible. So in the books of account, carve this separately. Assets eligible for depreciation, assets ineligible for depreciation for income tax purpose. In books of account, you can continue to depreciate based on useful life. Separate. For income tax, it will not form part of the block. In a subsequent occasion, when you sell it, as if it's an independent asset, like land, non-depreciable asset, livestock, non-depreciable asset. This is also something non-depreciable. You can compare the cost and sale price, book short-term or long-term capital loss, depending on the outcome. But it will not form part of the block. Therefore, no depreciation is allowable. I think there is one question comes something on. There is one question tax audit applicability when turnover is 1.7 crore, net profit is 2%, net profit 2%, cash receipt less than 5% of gross receipt, cash payment less than 5%. Now, for a moment, this query is on our fallout of our yesterday's discussion, but still let us be clear. Query says turnover is 1.7 crore. Cash receipts and cash payments are less than 5% of the total receipts and total payment. Now we'll examine the applicability in proviso below class A. Proviso below class A says your gross sales between 1 to 10 crore and gross sales receipts and payments are falling below 5% in cash as against the total. Then for you, the limit of 10 crore is applicable for audit. Turnover is only 1.7 crore. So therefore class A will say don't come for audit. Now, why do you worry about net profit 2%? Your doubt comes because of 4480. For 4480, when will audit come when you are offering less than 8% or 6%? Previously, you must have availed 4480. If previously you have availed 4480, then current year you walk out and you are unable to offer 8 or 6%, then since you are only offering 2%, audit will be warranted in class E of 44AB, not class A proviso. If previously you have not availed 4480 at all, this year is the first year, or previously for more than 1 crore, you kept on auditing it. Now, 1 to 10 crore, less than 5% cash, then you are not required to get the accounts audited. It is not required to be. Percentage of profit can be 2%, 5%, 10%, 1% minus. Let us not worry about it. Cash receipt on sale of immovable residential property, whether we need to report in Form 3CD, I mean section 269. Is the question about which in the next slide we will discuss. Well, we'll get into class 31, liability side of the balance sheet. 4 things we'll have to remember. I think given a scenario, we will be able to consider only the liability side of the balance sheet, but whatever queries came up, that much we'll discuss, so that there will not be a scenario of without knowing answer, you get out of the hall. Let that not happen. The discussion be conclusive. Now, what the liability side when you carry out audit, you need to see loans, deposits, specified sum, etc. Class 31, A, B, C, D, E. We'll take up first one family of loan and deposit. Loan. I am in need of money. I go and borrow from somebody. It is loan. In contrast, I am having money. I want to place this money with somebody to earn revenue. Then it is called a deposit. I go to Canara Bank, make 1 lakh rupees deposit. It is deposit. It is not loan. I have not given loan to Canara Bank. Canara Bank never said, please give me money. So it is not a loan. It is a deposit. But I am in need of money. I go and ask my friend. Now, who is at the mercy of whom? If the borrower is at the mercy of the lender, it is loan. If the lender is at the mercy of the borrower, it is a deposit. I go to Canara Bank and say, I'm going to give 1 lakh rupees. The manager may say, today it is 3:30, time is closed, come tomorrow. That means I am at his mercy to place my money. In that case, it is deposit. So first the section applied only to loan or deposit. Then they added specified sum. What is specified sum? Money in respect of immovable property related transactions. Right. Specified sum will come back little later. But for all the three, one family now. All the three comes into one family. Loan, deposit, specified sum. What is that? Limit 20,000 or 20,001. This is the unfortunate part in our law. Some places they'll say exceeding. Some of rupees so and so or more. So now this is such scenario. 20,000 itself will attract trouble. It is not 20,001. Unlike 40A3. 40A3 up to 10,000 no problem. 10,001 only will trigger problem. Here 20,000 itself will trigger the problem. It is not. So the limit should be 19,999. It is not 20,000. So ceiling, in order not to get caught, you have to see that 19,999. How do you read this ceiling of 19,999? It should not touch 20,000. How do you read? Should it be considered 1 year to next year? There can be another ceiling. 1 year, it should not touch 20,000. Next year from the same party, I can borrow another 19,500. Can this limit be drawn for year-to-year basis, or should it be drawn month-to-month basis? This month I can take 19,500, next month I can take from the same person 19,500. Otherwise, then by way of account pay cross check or draft or ECS mode. Or should I have to draw this limit per day? Today 19,500, tomorrow 19,500, possible. Or within this today morning 19,500, evening 19,500. How should I read this? Opening balance, some number is there. Also, I've got something during the year received. Should I have to aggregate or not to aggregate? How to read that? What the section says, no person shall accept deposit or no person shall receive loan or specified sum exceeding or of 20,000 or more, otherwise than by way of account pay cross check or draft or ECS. In which case, if at all somebody violates, what will be the consequence? Equivalent amount shall be levied as penalty under section 271D or 271E, as the case may be, either an accepting or repaying. Fine. How do we drop this? In one nutshell, I say, before you receive money either as deposit or as a loan or a specified sum. What is specified sum? Advances or otherwise in relation to immovable property related transaction. When you receive money in a mode which is prohibited, what else could be? Cash. When you receive money in cash, before receiving, see the opening balance from that party. I am receiving money from that part, from X. Before receiving the money, let me first see the opening balance. Okay. If the opening balance has already touched or crossed 20,000, then whatever now I am receiving should be only in a prescribed mode. Account pay cross check or draft or otherwise. It should not be in cash. If the opening balance does not touch or cross 20,000, opening balance is 17,500. Now how much I can receive? Opening balance 17,500. Now I'm going to take some more money. Then see the closing balance. Because of this transaction, if the closing balance touches or crosses 20,000, this transaction should be only in a permitted mode of account pay cross check or draft or ECS. 17,500 is my opening balance. I received 2,000 rupees now. See the closing balance, 19,500. 19,500 is falling less than 20. So this 2,000 rupees I can get in cash. 17,500 is the opening balance. I received 3,000 rupees. So closing balance 2,500, which is crossing 20. Therefore, this 3,000 I should receive only in permitted mode. So before receiving money, first ask what's the opening balance. If the opening balance already touched or crossed 20,000, current transaction should be not in cash. But opening balance falls below 20,000, then this transaction plus opening aggregate. Closing balance touches or crosses 20, then you will have to necessarily receive this particular transaction only in the prescribed mode. Fine. Now, come back to payment. Opening balance is already touched or crossed 20,000. In that case, 1 rupee you would like to pay. Opening balance before making payment already touched or crossed 20,000. 1 rupee you would like to pay. That should be only through permitted mode. If the opening balance already came below 20,000, then whatever you pay, it can be in any mode. So for receiving money, ask yourself whether opening touched or crossed 20. What do you receive subsequently? Through mode other than cash. Whatever repayment, opening balance touched or crossed 20, it should be only, even 1 rupee you make it. It should be only through account pay cross check or draft or ECS. Now, opening balance does not touch. Subsequently you receive, then ask question, after this transaction, what's the closing? That touches or crosses 20. This transaction should be only through account pay cross instrument or ECS. This, if you take, these things all will get addressed appropriately. It is neither per annum, nor per month, nor per day, nor per transaction, nor opening. Each transaction you should ask this question. Then you will have to say whether you have satisfied this condition or not. Now, in real life scenario, can you expect some exception to these transactions? Transaction between husband and wife. Money received otherwise than through account pay cross check. Between parent, son, daughter, loan received through account pay cross draft or otherwise. Retiring partner's balance payable subsequently paid. If he is not a retiring partner, is a regular partner drawing money, no problem. But having retired, he is no longer a partner. His balance is settled. Now, retired partner, our accounting teachers have said, upon retirement, money payable to the retiring partner should be removed from the capital account and designated as retired partner loan account. We ourselves say it's a loan account. Now, subsequently, whenever cash is available, you start writing as cash paid to the retiring partner. Then is it not amounting to violation? And limited company, direct as current account transaction, back and forth money coming and going for emergency. Share application money received. Technically, law does not provide for exception to any of these transactions. Technically, an officer can trouble saying all these are not exempt. Therefore, you will have to necessarily follow 216 T. You can't escape. Technically, that's a trouble. But courts have said between parents, son and daughter, husband and wife, you can take a lenient view. The purpose of the law is to see that people do not introduce black money. Here, when both the people are accessible, they have shown respective sources. Let us not technically trouble them. Courts have come for the rescue of first category. This direct as current account transaction also, so long as there is no fishy-fushy thing, really money is available in the source. Retiring partner's balance payable, a troublesome case if you designate it as a loan. If you designate as other sum payable, you can get out. Share application money, company law itself prohibits today not to accept in cash, therefore it is not possible. Now, coming to the reporting part, there is one loan, 1 lakh rupees. Balance sheet contains only 1 lakh opening balance. Current year received 50,000 in instrument, 30,000 paid through instrument, and balanced 120,000 appears in the closing balance sheet. How do we report? Assessee says, I've gone only by ACS. For that reason, can I say I'll not report at all? Can I say assessee has complied with? This is a peculiar clause, clause 31. Even if the assessee followed the law, we are required to report the number. Even if the assessee has followed the law, we are required to report the number. So now what happens? 1 lakh opening balance, received 50, 150, maximum balance 150. Going to payment side, opening balance 100, maximum balance 150, paid during the year 30. Even if he has followed the law, we are required to report it. We cannot say, sorry, since he has followed the law, we will not report it. Imagine if you are going to do an audit of an NBFC, RBI permitted them to accept deposits, public deposits, and give loans to various people. Afterwards, they receive loans and pay depositors as and when they wanted. They might have complied with the law. If you start filling up clause 31 for them, for acceptance of deposit and repayment of deposits, how many pages it will run? Technically speaking, you have to give, but what's the purpose it would serve if they have already complied with the law? So assessee can say, I've complied with the law. I'll report only violations. I'll not report the compliance part of it. In which case, what we have to say as an auditor, para 3 of 3CA, para 5 of 3CB, we should say, in clause 31, the assessee has decided to report only violations. Since there is no violation, they have not reported anything. Although technically the section and the clause requires their cases where they have complied with the law. Considering the volume, the assessee has decided not to report. So that qualification we have to give in para 3 of 3CA or para 5 of 3CB. Okay. That specified sum, advance, or otherwise in relation to immovable property transaction. Now, originally, why the specified sum came from 1/6/2017? People always used to say they've taken property advances whenever there is a cash shortage. To avoid that, government came up with this particular principle. Fine. But in the language, when deciding specified, them said transaction relating to immovable property by way of an advance or otherwise. Now, what confusion it created? Not only advance payment, anything received in cash in relation to immovable property is also covered as a specified sum. To take an example, one property is sold. Property is sold for, let us say, 5 lakh rupees. Now, that person purchasing has given 4,80,000 rupees DD. Some reason he has given 4,80,000 rupees DD. Balance 20,000 rupees he gives cash on the date of execution of sale deed. Documented in the sale deed also. 4,80,000 DD, 20,000 cash. Documents executed. Now, it is not advance. It is proceeds on sale of property. Now, whether the word specified sum take into account that receipt on the date of transfer of property. Technically, yes. Nowhere the language says advance alone is covered. Money received upon sale of the property will not be covered. Law does not say so. Technically, it will have to be reported, and consequential penal consequences will be there. It is not possible to say, one cannot rule out the possibility. So, on the date of sale of the property, if proceeds are received otherwise than through account pay across the check or draft, the language specified sum will encompass this particular quantum also, and one cannot rule out the possibilities of penal consequences. Right? In repayment, 3 additional classes are introduced: borrowed in the current year, repaid in the current year, borrowed in the opening, and repaid. So you'll have to bifurcate, because people, when borrow in current year and repay, they don't report both. Therefore, separate classes are introduced. All repayment of the current year you report first. Out of that, how much you borrowed in the current year and repaid in the current year itself, you have to report. In that, borrowed in cash, repaid. Borrowed in instrument otherwise than account pay crossed, repaid. That you have to make a bifurcation, because people many times square of both, and whatever closing alone they give. Therefore, government thought it fit to introduce this classification. 216 ST, many more things to be said, but make one thing very clear: 2 lakh rupees is ceiling, not 2 lakh 1, 2 lakh. So permissible number will be 199,999. So received one day in aggregate from one person, irrespective of what for you receive, caught. So the SSC is selling agricultural produce, receiving money from agricultural produce related sale. Law doesn't spare him. Circular of the board is very clear to say agricultural proceeds of the sale of agricultural produce is also not spared. So when you receive money in cash of 2 lakh or more, in respect of single transaction, in respect of many transaction on a single day, or in respect of an event or an occasion, then you will have to aggregate and you will have to report here. Now, what law says? You should not receive. No person shall receive. Law does not say no person shall pay. So what the law says? You don't receive. Law penalizes only the person who receives. Law does not penalize the person who pays. Fine. Now, what will be the consequence? The person receiving has to report. Person paying, law does not prohibit, but the clause says you report that also. Now, 2 classes for the receipt part, 2 classes for the payment part. Even if you are not penalized for paying in violation of 216 ST, you will have to report the payment part also. So when you give the payment part, what will be the consequence? The person who received from you, he will be put into trouble. Therefore, this information is gathered. So person receiving should report 2 classes. Person paying, even though law does not prohibit payment, needs to inform this in the relevant clause. The circulars and the notifications came exempting certain transactions, need to be borne in mind while carrying out this particular class. And if the volumes are many, you can do a test check, preserve that number. When you have done the test check, what period you have covered, keep that in mind. And keep this as a working paper. Then you can make a disclaimer in the para 3 and 5 of 3CA, 3CB that considering the volume, only a test check is done. Our institute guidance note permits it. But whatever is the period for which you have done a sample test, that documentation should say in that nothing strange has come. Therefore, you have applied the same principle for the rest of the period. I have taken only 15 days test check. 15 days, nothing came wrong. Therefore, I believe for the rest of the 350 days also same thing. But I take 15 days, and in the 15 days, I've come across 10 transactions against. I'll not restrict myself to report only this 10, because for 15 days population 10 number comes. I'll have to increase the population size to ensure the comfort level for me as an audit practice. So if I've taken 3 15-day sample or 4 15-day sample of each quarter, all of them say nothing. Therefore, I have believed the rest of them nothing. That way, that 4 quarter each 15 days, we have to preserve the data at which 15 days we picked up, how we conducted, what results we came up with. That data we should preserve so that tomorrow when peer review, quality review, tax audit quality review comes, it is possible for us to defend that we have gone with this particular working paper. Now, coming to labor welfare funds, there is only one question was there, therefore I'll pick up, because now this stops with the liability side of the balance sheet. Coming to income and expenditure, there are many more things to say, but only one important aspect I'll say. Labor welfare contributions, clause 20B talks about employee contribution, and employer contribution is discussed in clause 26, that is with reference to employer share. 43B will come. So now employee contribution start with April, May, June, July, August. What is the number counted received from employee? What is the due date of actual payment? What is the actual date of payment? We'll have to fill up. Now we cannot say 31st March alone, we will say every month we have to say for employee contribution. For employer contribution, it is not so. 31st March, whatever outstanding we can say. In filling up, what is the due date? Next month, 15th, we'll have to fill up. Some people adventurously took a view that employee contribution will also be governed along with employer contribution. And we have Madras High Court, Kerala High Court, and Gujarat High Court against the SSC. For them, there is no scope. Rest of them in favor of SSC, but prospective amendments came by Finance Act 21, saying for everybody will not give benefit. Past cases, these three jurisdictions, SC may not get relief unless Supreme Court takes a reverse scenario. Now, employer contribution, clause 26 discusses it. Now, what does it say? Not only labor welfare contributions, we have other instances: tax, cess, duty, bonus, interest on term loan or working capital loan from scheduled bank, public financial institution, leave encashment, for use of railway property, rent payable, all will be covered in 43B. Now here on balance sheet date, what is outstanding? That you have to report. Balance sheet date, how much is outstanding? How much you paid before the due date of furnishing return? Rather, due date of you are signing the report. You can't wait for due date of furnishing return, because audit report today has to be reported before 1 month of the due date of filing return. Up to you are signing the report, how much paid, how much not paid. So you can say so. Now what does it say? Now current year is the first year. Balance sheet outstanding, tax, bonus, provision made, employer contribution of labor welfare contribution. How much outstanding on balance sheet day? Before your signing of the report, how much you paid, how much not paid, you'll say. Fine. How much not paid? Not eligible for deduction. You voluntarily in computation disallowed. Go to next year. Opening disallowed how much? Out of that, how much paid during the current year? That will be allowed. How much not paid? Carried forward to next year. So out of the opening balance disallowance, how much paid, how much not paid, you have to report. Paid will qualify, not paid will not qualify within the financial year. Outstanding as the year end, before the due date of furnishing return, technically law permits, but as an auditor, we can say due date, within the date of furnishing the report, how much is possible, that we will have to give. What is not paid, we'll have to give separately. Now, earlier, the due date of furnishing return, due date of the furnishing tax audit report, one and the same, no much difference. Today, legislature from last year distinguished this. 1 month before the due date of furnishing return, one audit report has to be given. So we are giving audit report. But assessee says, 43B says, up to due date, I can make payment. After you released the audit report, before filing the return, I have made some more payments. Why should I not claim? He claims it. Because up to the date of furnishing return, whatever payment made, he claims. Now what CPC will do? CPC will say, auditor said this much paid, this much not paid. Your return says you have paid more, not paid is less. Therefore, why should I not adjust? For this, the law rule itself says you are entitled to file a revised tax audit report before assessee furnishes the return of income. So I issued the tax audit report. Let us say for the current year, 31st December non-audit case. I'll say this way, 14th of January, I first give tax audit report. Before 12th of February, assessee makes some more payment and says, I'm going to claim this. Legally, I am entitled to, assessee has every right to ask the auditor to file a revised tax audit report for incorporating 43B related payments made after the issue of the first report, but before filing the return of income. This is one occasion where the law recognizes revision of the tax audit report. I mentioned in the question answer session that one occasion you can legally file. This is the occasion. Rest are clerical errors, you can always take it up. Then I think rest of them, this one example you take. This one example is very crucial. Let us take. Fixed deposit made with bank, let us say Corporation Bank or today Punjab National Bank for 3 years in December 2020. Anticipating there will not be a requirement to have funds, therefore they have made a long-term deposit of 3 years. Subsequently, they were in need of money. The assessee is in need of money. Therefore, loan was taken against the FD. He was about to close the FD, but manager said, why do you close FD? Take a loan. Later on, you can pay as and when you get the money. Therefore, the FD will continue to earn you interest. Today, if you close it, balance money, you have to put a separate FD, etc. Why to unnecessarily lose this? Because of the advice of the manager, he has taken loan against FD in February 20. Now, year end you are closing, interest accrued on FD 1.5 lakhs, interest on loan against FD 1.1 lakh. Manager says, why do you worry about interest? 3 year end we'll see. You don't need to worry. So the assessee did not worry. Now we are going to make a 43B questions. Now 43B says interest on term loan or working capital loan from a scheduled bank. Unless paid before the due date of furnishing return, it will not qualify for deduction. Now you ask assessee, sir, you have earned 1.5 lakh interest income, 26 years shows this, therefore we are offering it. Also, you have claimed 1.1 lakh rupees interest on the loan against fixed deposit. But 43B says you have to pay before the due date of furnishing return. Otherwise, we will not claim this. It is difficult. The assessee says, why should I pay? Manager says at the end of 3rd year, we can decide. Why should I pay? Now, income tax department says any interest on term loan or working capital loan from a scheduled bank. What does section 43B start with? Notwithstanding anything contained in section 28 to 43. A deduction otherwise allowable shall not be allowed irrespective of the method of accounting followed unless paid before the due date of furnishing return of income, before the end of the financial year, in the year in which it accrues before the due date of furnishing return of income. All right. So now first you have to ask a question whether 43B compels you to make this payment even if the banker says don't pay. We'll discuss at the time of closure of the FD. Now you read that clause carefully. Interest on term loan or working capital loan from scheduled bank or public financial institutions as per the terms and conditions of the contract. If the terms and conditions of the contract requires you to make this payment before the end of the financial year and still you have not made payment before the due date of furnishing return, 43B can come into the play and disallow this debit, disallow the claim of that particular payment or that particular expenditure. So 43B can only compel a disallowance only if it is otherwise due for payment. If as per the terms and conditions of the agreement, I am not even required by the bank to pay this interest up to the expiration of 3rd year. Because of 43B, I should not be compelled to pay this money. That is what 43B says. So therefore, by a classic reading of interest on term loan or working capital loan from scheduled bank, if you stop there, it will give you an impression that this 1.1 lakh rupees we have to disallow because it is paid only at the end of 3rd year. But as per the terms of the contract, is what it ends with. So therefore, 43B cannot compel an assessee to make a payment which is not otherwise fallen due on 31st of March. If something has fallen due on 31st of March, but not paid before due date of furnishing return, a disallowance can be warranted. If it is not fallen due, you are entitled to go by your mercantile system. That cannot be disputed at all. Now, 3rd year 43B can come, because as per contract, it has to be paid that day. If you don't pay before the end of that year, also up to the due date of furnishing return, disallowance can come. But in the first year and second year, it cannot come. It's something which one has to keep in mind. I think there are many more things to add. What I've given only a bird's eye view on what so far we have discussed. We'll stop at this stage and we'll pick up questions on those matters which we have left over and few other questions, and then we will proceed based on the, even not necessarily for the classes which we have discussed, anything classes we have not discussed, you have any queries, post those queries. I'll try to answer those queries, and then we will stop with that, because there are many more things. If you see the slides, I can continue to keep adding a lot more things to add, and income side, expenses side, and also deemed income and losses, partnership, TDS related transactions, partnership form. I think one of our friend has raised a question on this partnership, will take up, and company 5627B, one friend has asked a question, will take up that. Few other matters and other few additional aspects which we will have to report. All this we don't have much time to discuss, but this one question I will say, then we'll take up questions. What will be the consequences if there is no tax audit report furnished? One of the queries raised this question. 271B. 0.5% of turnover or 1.5 lakh rupees, whichever is less, will be the penalty. That's a consequence. The person says, I have not even maintained books, I have not got it audited. Then for not maintaining books, the penalty will be 271A, 25,000 rupees. Some assessees were so adventurous. They said, I have not maintained books, I have not got it audited. The officer said, you have not maintained books, 25,000 penalty. You have not got it audited in spite of your turnover, 1.5 lakh rupees penalty. The assessee went up to tribunal and said, my lords, when I don't even have the books, how can you expect me to get it audited? Let the revenue decide whether they want to slap penalty under 271A, 25,000, or 271B, 1,50,000. Let them first decide. If they say, I've got books, but I've not got audited, 1.5 lakh rupees penalty. If they say, I've not got books, therefore I have to pay 25,000, where is the question of paying 1.5 lakh? So, in case where the assessee claims he has not even maintained books, then penalty will be 25,000 for not maintaining books, in which case, not getting audited, that consequence will not come, therefore he will escape. Both penalties not possible. And audit report dated, very important. Now, 15th of January this year, date given for furnishing audit report. For filing return, 15th February. If an audit report dated 15th January, will there be any consequence? Will there be any consequence? Please see the language of the law. We saw yesterday the section 44AB, every assessee. Then A, B, C, D, E, get his accounts of such previous year audited by an accountant before the specified date and furnish by that date report of such audit. So what does it say? The obligation is to obtain the report from the auditor by assessee before the specified date, not on that specified date or by that specified date. So physically audit report is required to be issued at least on 14th January. 15th it cannot be. Then 15th it can be uploaded to the income tax department. Assessee can approve on the website on 15th. But if you see carefully the classes in the electronic form, date of the report, date of uploading the report. Two classes are there. Why should there be? Date of the report should not be 15th. It should be at least 1 day prior. Date of uploading can be 15th because it should be obtained before the specified date, but can be furnished by that date. Date of uploading can be 15th, but date of obtaining, the date of report should be 1 day before. Otherwise, it will be leading to non-compliance of this provision. There are 2 tribunal judgments where the assessee said, I have complied with the law by my auditor giving on the last day the report. But the assessing officer said no. He slapped the penalty on this particular case. Matter traveled to tribunal. Tribunal said, even though the language here is before specified date, you can call it as on or before specified date. Merely because they date the report on 15th doesn't mean they commence and conclude only on the day. Audit could have been commenced and continued in the past also. Therefore, a liberal view is required to be taken. Let us not create another case law. Date of the report, let us see that at least one day prior. Date of uploading can be the last day. If you take up that principle clearly in your mind, this sort of unnecessary litigations can be avoided. Imagine the plight of the assessor and the auditor when you finish the audit, finish the work completely, put the date of the report as 15. For that reason, you receive penalty notice for the assessor and you have to defend the case until up to tribunal, something which is not warranted, which can be avoided. Fine. Now we'll take up questions.
So you will be taking up any questions, sir, or
whatever in the chat box will finish.
okay.
We have carried over certain questions from the past session because it was dealt in a subsequent session. We'll take up from that, and then any other questions are there other than what we have discussed also relating to tax audit, we'll pick up.
But that questions won't, yesterday's questions won't be visible now, sir, because of the chat box.
No, yesterday we have finished.
It's okay, okay. No issue.
Today all the questions we have finished. Now, few questions which we came in the 6 o'clock session, we have carried over for today for this. That will pick up now.
Right.
What are the questions? I think we have to start with 5627B, right? One question has come on 5627B. What does it say? One column 29 dealing with 5627B, partnership firm having 1 lakh rupees capital converted into private limited company with authorized capital of 50,000 and share premium of 50,000. No receipt in private limited company, whether 5627B applicable. Let us examine the applicability of 5627B independent of this fact, and then we'll get into the fact. If you are a private limited company issuing shares to a resident assessee at a price higher than the face value, for the premium what you charge, you should have justification. If you are able to give justification that the premium is reasonable, either by following 11 UA method or by going net asset or DCF method, then to the extent it is found reasonable, no problem. Over and above you have charged, which is found to be unreasonable, to that extent it will be treated as income of the company in the year of issuing that share at premium. This is the principle of law. Apply this principle on the facts of this case. A firm converted into partnership, firm converted into company. 1 lakh was the capital of the firm into company divided to 50,000 towards capital, 50,000 towards premium. Now, if it's an ongoing partnership firm, which has got not only capital, also some reserves, etc., in the partnership shared by the partners before conversion, it is capable of generating revenue from day one. By the DCF method, justifying 50,000 premium should be nothing. Easily one can do it. But it is a firm which is dormant with 1 lakh rupees capital, did not do any business whatsoever. Now you convert that firm into company. 50,000 capital, 50,000 premium. On the day one of the company, how do you justify 50,000 rupees premium? Difficult. There the problem will come. So first we will have to see whether it's an ongoing firm which is capable of generating revenue. If it is so, justifying 50,000 premium, nothing. Easily one can explain. Otherwise, it is an issue. Second one is labor welfare fund contribution. Should it be shown in class 20? Employee contribution of labor related matters you will have to consider. If you don't recover from employee, you pay everything out of your pocket, it will come under 2643. Next is with reference to, I think many other questions we have covered Cash receipt on sale of property, whether we need to report in 3CD. Yes, class 31 DE. We have mentioned specified sum. On sale of property, you receive cash 20,000 or above, advance or otherwise, technically specified sum will come, 216 SS will come. It is not 2 lakh rupees, it is 20,000 because 20 specified sum will come and anything other than specified sum will come under 216 ST. Here section 216 yes will apply. 20,000 is the limit, 19,999 you can receive cash, otherwise it will be caught under 216 SS. In class 31 will apply for scheduled secured loan from bank. When you receive loan from bank, it is not required because there is a specific exception provided, so you are not required to report it. Salaried employee trading in shares and securities in a financial year exceed tax audit limit, we need to file tax audit report. Whether it needs compliance of 44AB. Whether it's a salaried employee or otherwise, why should we worry? He has traded in shares and securities. Apply the criteria of turnover. If it crosses, ask him to maintain books. Everything will be banking channel. Less than 5% cash, less than 5% payment. Up to 10 crore rupees, no need to worry. After 10 crore, he does it in spite of being a salaried employee, audit is warranted. Should repayment and borrowing both be shown under receipt and payment of 216 SS and ST? Borrowing has to be separately shown. For the same as the same person, for in the same financial year, you have paid a portion of it, repayment has to be separately shown. So borrowing, as because you have shown borrowing, repayment cannot be dispensed with. As because you have shown repayment, borrowing cannot be dispensed with. Independently, both have to be shown. What amount should be disclosed? Whether squared up, option on 216 SS and T. Good question. Let us say, for example, 1 lakh rupees opening balance I have got from Mr. X. Current year I have received 30,000. So maximum balance outstanding 130. Entire 130 I paid during the year. So closing balance is 0. Now how will I fill up the borrowing component? Opening balance 1 lakh. Now received during the year 30,000. Maximum balance outstanding 130. Whether squared up during the year, that means whether balance brought to 0 during this year. Answer yes. What we should say, whether squared up, whether if the facts are such that we have made the balance 0, then we have to say yes in that particular class. Should interest on loan given by the director to the company also be disallowed under 43B if not paid yearly as agreed by them? So now for giving information under 43B, the loan should have been borrowed either from a scheduled bank or from a public financial institution. Money received from third parties other than these two will not come under 43B, and non-payment of interest in cash or through account pay mode, etc., but added to the loan account will not result in disallowance. Interest on MSME not paid by the company. Consequences. Section 23 of MSME Act will come. If you make a provision, you are required to make a provision in the books of the company being a limited company, and you have to show it is payable, and whether or not you pay before the due date. It is not coming under 43B. It will come under section 23 of the MSMED Act, whereby any interest provided for shall be disallowed in the hands of the company while computing its income. If a private limited company changed to LLP, what are the compliances? Outside the concept of 44AB, but still, please examine the provisions of section 47, class 13B, dealing with converting the limited company into LLP. If there is a secured creditor, you cannot convert. If there is an unsecured creditor with the consent of all unsecured creditors, you can convert. But converting a limited company into LLP law does not prohibit anything other than this. But in the income tax law, you have certain more conditions in section 47(13)(b). All the assets and liabilities of the company before the conversion should become the assets and liabilities of the LLP. All the shareholders of the company should become the partners in the same ratio of the LLP, and at least the reserves, whatever you are having on the date of such conversion, at least next 5 years, you should continue to have that reserve, which should not get diluted. Then the turnover of the LLP should not exceed 40 lakh rupees before conversion any of the 3 preceding years. The asset side total of the balance sheet in last 3 years before the conversion should not touch or cross 5 crore rupees. If you satisfy all these conditions, then conversion of the limited company into LLP shall not be a tax triggering event. It's a tax neutral transaction. Thereafter, the partners having interest in LLP can continue to go. If you don't satisfy these conditions, either in the year of conversion or in a subsequent year when the time frame is fixed, then if subsequent to that conversion, if you are violating, it will be treated, the amount what is claimed as exempt at the time of conversion will be treated as taxable in the hands of the converted LLP. So this compliance we will have to keep in mind. For F&O business, how turnover to be computed for each settlement, whether plus or minus, ignore the sign, total the numbers, what comes is only the turnover. I think fairly any other question in the chat box left, you can show. Otherwise, from my reading, I have covered everything.
More or less everything covered. There was nothing.
Excepting one candidate wrote about explain two businesses, petrol pump and wines. I do not know what he tries to come up with. Whether two audit reports are clubbed into one. If club ratios vary, I think if you read both the queries, if the assessee has got petrol pump business as well as wine, that is liquor sales, IMFL, whether to give two audit reports separately or to give only one report. And if at all we do one report and give accounting ratios, class 41, the ratios will vary. Doesn't matter. Why do you worry about that? You give nature of business. Petrol pump sales separately you give, wines separately you give nature of business. That class 41 did not ask you to give the business wise ratio. It asked you to give assessee wise ratio. So for each assessee, all the businesses put together, both the transaction of manufacturing, trading, services, aggregate everything. Ratio will not give a picture which otherwise for each industry it will appear. They will bifurcate further. But as an auditor, what you have to see, assessee as a whole, aggregate all the businesses, services, trading, manufacturing, aggregate and arrive at the ratio. It will be distortive, but our guidance note says, let us not worry about it, give the number. They will do research internally and then based on the sales, etc., they will work it out. But for us, number may be distortive in terms of ratio, but we'll have to consolidate and give together. I think we have covered everything, Suresh.
Yes, sir. I think you have covered extensively, sir. The entire tax audit you have tried to cover up in the 2 sessions, sir. Right from
but many other aspects like classes dealing with partnership company or expenses, etc., we could not do justice considering the paucity of time.
Given time frame, you are given try to cover up the entire thing as much as possible. And I think this would have given all the students a fair idea of how to look into each of these classes, how each of the sections has to be interpreted, each word has what kind of meaning it has to be applied. Earlier, they might have the knowledge of how the definitions will play a significant role in each of these classes, but your using explanation have made them clear understanding of all those combined reading of the section, the classes in the form and the rules. So I think this is an extremely fantastic session for the students to get in-depth dive into the tax audit thing during this season. And I mean, on behalf of SIRC and on behalf of all the students who have participated, I wholeheartedly thank you for spending your time and despite your busy schedule and the working days. Thanks a lot for your time, sir. Thanks, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Stay safe. Thank you.